This video is going to walk you through some ideas of the philosopher Plato, who's an ancient philosopher. He is probably the single most influential philosopher in the history of philosophy. Plato was the student of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle. Both of these figures you'll be reading about in your course readings. And one 20th century philosopher said that, in fact, all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. That's quite a claim to say that all of philosophy is a footnote to the philosopher Plato. Well, there's some truth to this. The people that influenced Plato are called pre-Socratic philosophers. So Socrates was Plato's teacher, and before Socrates, there were quite a few other philosophers, but we only have fragments of their writings. And each of these thinkers contributed some ideas to philosophical thought in ancient Greece, but they didn't quite develop the sort of systematic approach to philosophy that Plato did. Plato's thought covers everything that can be covered in philosophy, which includes thinking about logical realities, thinking about the nature of reality, metaphysics, the nature of goodness in ethics, in aesthetics, in beauty, and in knowledge and truth in the field of epistemology. These other pre-Socratic thinkers that came some of them a few hundred years before the time of Plato, were people like Thales, who basically thought that everything was water. I think he must have been a surfer. And then a philosopher named Anaximander kind of thought that everything was boundless, there was no limits. Anaximenes reduced everything to air. Pythagoras also to water. Maybe you've heard of the Pythagorean theorem. Heraclitus thought that everything in it was in motion. Maybe you've heard the idea that you can't step in the same river twice. That was Heraclitus' idea. And then Parmenides, he was kind of the opposite of Heraclitus. He thought that there was only one thing that was fixed and permanent, unlike Heraclitus, who thought that everything was motion. So it's kind of interesting to see how Plato takes these pre-Socratic thinkers and advances on them. Now, just a couple words about Plato's predecessor, Socrates. Socrates dies in 399 BC. Now, some philosophers you'll see write BCE, which I think in contemporary times means before the Common Era, but because I'm a Christian, I'm going to say it's before the Christian era. Now, Socrates himself, although a philosopher, he did not write anything himself. All of his dialogues were recorded or were remembered by his students, including Plato. And in Plato's work, Plato will use Socrates as a figure in the dialogues, either representing both Socrates' ideas and Plato's ideas, or maybe sometimes only Socrates' ideas themselves, and maybe sometimes in Plato's dialogues only Plato's ideas himself. Now, Socrates disagreed with some of these pre-Socratic philosophers, as well as philosophers that lived during his lifetime. He disagreed with the particular group of philosophers called the sophists. Now, sophists were people who were paid to do philosophy. They really weren't even doing philosophy. They were kind of paid to do to think about how to convince people in arguments, primarily in arguments in courts of law, maybe getting the better of other people in terms of contracts and gaining high offices or lawsuits, or those kinds of things. Socrates really disagreed with these thinkers. Socrates thought the purpose of philosophy was to find the truth, not simply to display logical dominance. And so Socrates, because he was so enamored and fixated on the truth of things, he was ultimately arrested for encouraging atheism in the youth, which was a false charge. There are actually two things he was accused of. One was denying the gods of the state. The other was corrupting the youth. So it's kind of both of these are found in this bullet point here on encouraging atheism in the youth. This is a false charge. And he was put on trial for his disruptions that he caused in Athens and ultimately executed for doing nothing more than making powerful enemies amongst people who were only concerned with their reputation and power and not concerned for the truth and living a good life in a virtuous way. Maybe you've heard the phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living. That's from a work called The Apology, which is an account of Socrates' trial, which Plato himself wrote and recorded. And you have to think about this idea, the unexamined life is not worth living. What kind of life is an unexamined life? Well, it's probably a life in which you just don't think much about anything other than the fleeting things of this world. And Socrates said that kind of life is not even really a human life. And since it's not a human life, it certainly isn't worth it. There are things that are greater than this fleeting and temporal world, things like truth and goodness and beauty. And Socrates was the kind of person who wanted to pursue those, and Plato was his student and followed them as well. Now, Plato had a particular view of the world, and one of the main distinctions you want to think about, and you'll see this in your reading in the Introduction to Philosophy text that you're reading. Plato made a distinction between kind of two realms of reality, two ways of thinking about the nature of what's real. He took the Parmenidean idea, Parmenides was one of these pre-Socratic thinkers, about the idea of permanence and unchanging reality, but he also took an idea from Heraclitus, that's the guy that said, you can't step in the same river twice. And he took both of these ideas and thought, there's something both right about these people, these other thinkers. Parmenides was right that there do seems to be things that are one, that maintain their identity no matter what happens, that are permanent, and that may form the basic material of all reality. Think about mathematics. Mathematical truths don't change over time. 1 plus 1 is 2 back in ancient Greece, even before there were people to think about it. And it's true in the Middle Ages, and it's true today. Right? That seems to be a unchanging, permanent reality. But then, of course, physical things change. Technology changes. Um, Geography changes, right? I mean, there's mountains are formed all the time. Volcanoes erupt. Rivers flood. They change their course. Canyons deepen. There's constant change and motion and flux in the world. Plato thought that those two were both real, but he thought the thing that is most important and permanent, that is the most real. And the many are the things that are real, but they're not as real as the things that are permanent and unchanging. So Plato thought that both of these things were the case. Well, just a couple things about Plato's life. He died in 348 BC, so this is a couple hundred years before the time of Christ. If you think in terms of a Christian timeline, this is roughly in the intertestamental period between the New and the Old Testament, or in the life of the Jewish people, roughly about the time of the return from exile, from the Babylonian exile, and the rebuilding of the Second Temple. He was from a wealthy family, Plato was. He was an artist and a poet. He was acquainted with pre-Socratic philosophers such as Heraclitus, and he also studied with the Pythagorean philosophers. And he started a school of philosophy. This is unlike Socrates, who didn't start a school, never published anything. Plato started a school. It's called the Academy. And he had students, and he taught there. And so he was kind of like a professional philosopher, you might say, whereas Socrates was not. He was an amateur. Plato loved philosophy like an amateur, but he was a professional philosopher. All right, so now on to some of Plato's main ideas. Plato's metaphysics and epistemology are two major features of Plato's philosophy. Just as a reminder, the word metaphysics means the study of the basic nature of what's real, or the study of being as being, or the study of the nature of existence. That's metaphysics. Epistemology is the study of the nature of knowledge, which includes truth and maybe the reasons that we have for our knowledge, and also things like belief. So, metaphysics and epistemology, those are the two major areas of philosophy, along with axiology, or the study of value. Plato, as I mentioned already, takes a synthesis approach between Heraclitus, the idea that everything is changing, and Parmenides, that there's only permanence. He thought that this world was clearly transitory, so motion and change must happen. right? He didn't deny the reality of change and motion. He thought they were real. But things also have identities that persist through change, which seems to indicate that the world does not change where these realities exist. So this would include things like the human soul, right? You are the same person across time. And that seems to indicate that there's something real that about you, especially, even though your body changes. And of course, our mental life develops, but our personal identity, that is me being me or you being you, our soul, our rational faculties especially, don't change. So Plato gives a couple of notions that are fairly important for his philosophy. There's three of them. One is called the forms. This is a notion about metaphysics, the nature of reality. In his book called The Republic, he talks about this idea of something called the divided line. It's really an image about the division of reality. And then finally, there's a story in his book called The Republic, which I highly encourage you to read. It's not part of our course, but in my opinion, if you want to be an educated person, you have to read his book called The Republic. And in that book, in chapter 7 of that book, he gives something called the allegory of the cave, which is a really interesting kind of story about the nature of what's real. So let's talk about these in turn. First, the forms. What are forms? Well, in some ways, the human intellect is the kind of thing that can be or acquiesce the forms. Forms are going to end up being abstract objects, but they are accessible to us because of our rational soul. That is that or our minds. And on Plato's view, he thought that everyone was a pre-existent eternal soul. Kind of had this strange view of the pre-existence of your soul and the continued existence of your soul. Now, there's something right about this from even a Christian perspective. We do have a soul that continues forever, but unlike Plato, Christians don't believe that our souls pre-existed in any form other than maybe being thought of by God. But it's not like we existed in some strange Platonic heaven and then came into being and then pass out of being and do it again, which is roughly what Plato thought. But Plato thought that we had an eternal pre-existent soul, and that the world itself was modeled from a pre-existing matter, but by something he called the demiurge. The demiurge, he talks about this in one of his dialogues called the Timaeus. And the demiurge is that which studies the forms. And the forms, again, we'll maybe get to that in a moment, but the forms are these pre-existing realities. Let me give you an example. Think of something like the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, when you talk about a right triangle, right? Or say even a mathematical reality, 2 times 3 is 6, or 3 times 3 is 9, right? Those are mathematical formal realities. They're real, they're not physical. They seem to be timeless. They don't seem to be dependent on time or the passage of time. Yet nevertheless, these things, because they're real, they have to come from somewhere. And Plato thought there was kind of this eternal, pre-existing um, being. He called it a demiurge or demiurge, which is kind of like a Christian notion of God, but it's impersonal. And this being studies the forms, these eternal realities, and from studying them creates matter, which is also kind of pre-existent in some way. So it's kind of a unique view about the way in which the material world is related to the eternal world. The forms themselves, however, are absolute essences of all things that exist in a world of permanence. So forms, let's take, for example, the form of a circle, right? So we'll use a geometric example. What is a perfect circle, right? Now we could draw a bunch of circles, right? You don't have to look very far to find circles that show up in the material world. But is that what a circle is, right? I mean, if I make a circle with my hands like this or something, right, with my hands like this, and I say, okay, there's a circle. But what if it breaks, right? What if it shrinks? Oh wait, okay, now there's 2 circles, right? I can do 2, I can do 1. 1 moves and 2 come into being, and then they're both gone, right? So these things that we make with our hands or draw with figures or on paper or something, those aren't permanent realities. But circularity, well, circularity itself, now that's something that seems to be permanent, right? And we can conceive of it mathematically or geometrically. Right? How do you define a perfect circle? I don't know, I'm not a mathematician, but you could say something like, look, the perfect circle is, uh, well, take a single point on a plane and find all the points equidistant from that point and connect those points together in a line. That would be a circle. And we could define it. We can grasp it with our intellects. And then we use that to specify the reality that we see in circles in the physical world. So if I see a circular object like the, I don't know, maybe I could use this book here by Plato. You can see the O on Plato's Republic. There's a circle. So when I look at that, I think, oh, that looks like a single point with all points equidistant from it on a plane. I pick the point in the middle, all the points equidistant from that center point. That's a circle, right? So we're aware of what a circle is in the actual world by comparing it to that permanent essential nature in an abstract realm. Now, for Plato, everything is going to have forms, right? We ourselves, we used to exist prior to our life in this world, and we used to kind of be in some kind of pre-existing state where we could see things like circles in their perfect nature, or things like triangles in their perfect nature. But not only mathematical or geometric realities have forms, but also artifacts have forms. Say the form of a pen. Right? Let me grab a pen here. Right? So this thing called a pen, right? On Plato's view, this could exist as an abstract object, not the extended actual physical thing, but the form of a pen. What's the form of a pen? Well, it's a writing instrument with ink inside with a point that allows the ink to come out, right? And you might say, well, yeah, but this didn't come to exist until what, the sometime in the 1900s, right? In the last century or so. Now, there are other kinds of pens, styli and ink and things like that. But for Plato's view, that form of a pen, or say the form of a cat, right, the essential nature of a cat existed prior to the cat, and it existed in some abstract realm. Now, Plato thinks that everything in the material world has an essential form that pre-exists in an abstract way, and we as humans, because our souls exist prior to their instantiating themselves in the material world, we were able to gain knowledge of those things prior to our own existence. So Plato says, though, yeah, but when our soul enters the body, it forgets everything about the forms. Kind of unfortunate. But still, we can learn here on earth, when we do so, we are actually remembering the things that we already know from our time with the forms. Plato gives an example of this in a dialogue called the Meno, and there's a famous paradox in that dialogue. But what Plato does is he takes a servant in the household where the dialogue takes place, and he asks the owner of the household, "Hey, does your servant here have an education?" And the guy says, "No, he doesn't. He's not been to school." And so Plato says, "Yeah, let me bring him here, and I'll prove to you that he knows geometry." And so Plato starts asking him, Socrates rather, in the dialogue, starts asking this servant, this young boy, all these questions about mathematics. And through a series of questions and answers, it the servant demonstrates that he can give the correct answers to complex geometrical puzzles. And Plato says, Plato using Socrates as his character in the dialogue, says, look, this seems to prove that we have uh, knowledge prior to our own sensory experiences in this world. So Plato thought that when we learn on Earth, we're actually remembering things we already knew. This is kind of Socrates called himself a midwife. A midwife is someone who helps draw out what is already in the soul in terms of knowledge. So when we have gaps in our knowledge here and now, I mean, all of us have very large gaps because we all have to learn lots of things. These are just gaps in memory. And we then, through our experience and having study, these things are drawn out to us by our teachers. Now, of course, you can't know what you don't know. Right? You can't know what you don't know. But when you come to know, then you can't have not known it, because if you didn't know it, then you can't know it now, right? So this is it's called the Meno paradox, right? Let me clarify the paradox. If you already know then you don't need to know, right? But is it true that we already have all knowledge? No. So we need to have knowledge. We don't have it. But if we don't have it at all, we have no knowledge, then we can't come to know at all. Because if we have no knowledge, we don't even know how to get knowledge, right? You see the paradox? In other words, if we have knowledge, we don't need to learn. But of course, we need to learn, right? Which means that we don't have knowledge. But if we don't have knowledge, we don't even know if we need to learn. So it's kind of this weird paradox. So Socrates solved this by saying, look, by nature, and maybe by help from a philosopher, we get the knowledge drawn out of us. Now, for Plato, the soul is trapped in the body. Now, some philosophers vary their opinions on this with Plato. It's not clear if Socrates himself, Plato's teacher, thought that the body is bad or the body is good. In the dialogue called the Phaedo, this is the death of Socrates, where Socrates has to drink hemlock. When he's convicted of his corrupting the youth charge and denying the gods of the state, he's executed. And the form of execution was to drink hemlock, which is like a poison. And when he's about to drink the hemlock, it is the last word that Socrates said. Now, Plato was not present at this scene, but he recorded it later from some of the people who were there. Socrates says his last words are, "I drank what?" No, I'm just kidding. That's not what he said. I know it's a bad joke, but it's a philosophy class. Got to throw in some dumb jokes every now and then. No, he did not say, his last words were not, "I drank what?" His last words were, "Go offer a rooster to Asclepius." Go offer a chicken to Asclepius. Uh, Asclepius was the god of healing. And so some philosophers say, look, Plato thought that the body was an illness, and to be healed from it was a great gift. It's what we want, is to be rid of our bodies so we can be healed from it, so we can return to this realm of the forms and have knowledge purely and directly. Now, other philosophers interpret this to say, no, Socrates was grateful to be healed from his ignorance, but he did not eschew the body. That is, he did not reject the body as something intrinsically bad. He was not an asceticist. Okay, so here's the next little part here. This is the discussion of what's called the divided line. So we've talked a little bit about the forms. Let's talk a little bit about the divided line. So this is an illustration that shows up in Plato's Republic, Book 6. And what Plato does is he divides reality into two parts, an upper part and a lower part. Okay, so this diagram here has four kind of quadrants, but think of the first division as this division right here in this middle part. Okay, so he takes this part and he puts reality is divided into two parts. Plato's what's called a dualist. He thought that reality had two parts to it, a lower part and an upper part. Now, the left side of the diagram, let's call this the M side, which stands for metaphysics, the metaphysical side, and over here is the epistemic or the epistemological side. So this side over here is going to talk about the division of reality in terms of its nature, that is, what is ultimately real. On this side, this is going to be the how we know what is ultimately real. Okay, so let's look at this diagram in turn. First, the M side is the side of being, and the E side is reason. That is how we access this reality. Let me back up. So on the being side, this is going to be the realm of the forms, the realm of permanent, unchanging realities. This is a realm where things exist permanently. There's no change. This is a realm of eternal things that are totally real and never change. Again, think of like the perfect circle, right? Circularity itself exists in this upper realm, this abstract realm. This is the realm of things that are non-physical. The perfect circle is not physical. You can't like hold it in your hand or smell it or burn it or something like that. It's an abstract. All mathematical realities are abstract. All forms, the nature of a dog, the nature of what it means to be human, the nature of a palm tree, the nature of a fish, all of these natures, these essential realities, those are abstract realities, and they're eternal. They don't change. They're permanent. And through them, they inform the things that are lower down. We'll get to that in a moment. Now, how do we know these permanent abstract realities? Well, we know them through pure reason. Our intellects grasp those realities simply by thinking about it. Now, of course, Plato gives an elaborate account of how this works in his book called The Republic, but that's, I think, good enough for our purposes. The next level down is what you might call the conceptual level. Now, the conceptual level, this is the realm of mathematics, and these kinds of things we know through our understanding, right? That is, you have to learn them and then you grasp them. But again, this upper realm is purely through the intellect, through the intellect. Now we're going to go below this next level down. This is ordinary objects, things like pens or t-shirts or books or whatever, just ordinary objects in the physical world. Down up here, this is the realm of pure unchanging reality. Down here, this is the realm of changing reality, impermanence or flux, constant change. Ordinary object, right? This pen, it can change. I can take the ink out, and now it's not a pen anymore. It's just a piece of plastic that's hollow. Maybe I could use it as a straw, right? Take the bottom out and sip on it. I don't know if I want to do that. Might not be sanitary. Do not try this at home, right? This is the realm of objects, the things that are just ordinary objects in the world. And we know these by believing about them. Now, you might think belief sounds a little too, like, religious ish. The word belief here just means we come to form ordinary beliefs about them, primarily through sense perception, right? But of course, our sense perception can be mistaken, right? Belief just here means ordinary beliefs that are formed by perception. I look at this thing and what do I see? I see a pen, right? So what do I believe it is? A pen. Could I be wrong? Yeah, maybe it's just a fake pen. Right? You ever go into, I don't know if they still do this anymore, but I remember when like smartphones kind of first came out and you go into like the Verizon store and you're like, you go over the shelf and like, oh, cool, the new iPhone. And you pick it up and it's like a dummy phone. It looks just like an iPhone, but it doesn't work. It's just like a shell, right? So belief. Now the lowest level down is images, right? Images are, well, just that, images. What's an image? I don't know. Let me see if I can grab one here. Here's our book for the class, right? And on this book, there is an image. See that there? Right? Hold it up into the screen. This is an image of the School of Athens, painting by Raphael. And, yeah, by Raphael. Let's make sure I got the painter right. Let's get Raphael in my so, right, this is an image. Is this the actual thing, the actual object of Plato and Socrates talking? No, it's lower down in reality. It's just a picture of them. This is a painting, right? So images we know by our imagination, right? It's where the word comes from. Image, imagination. It's the same kind of root here, right? So let me just explain how this divided line works here on the left side. As you go up the left side of this diagram, things become more real. Things become more real. And as you go up on the epistemic side, things become more known. More known. Let me give you an example of this. This may not be the best example, but it'll work for our purposes. Think of the concept, think of the notion of friendship, right? Friendship. So suppose I said, I want to tell you about friendship. You're like, yeah, tell me what you know about friendship. And so I say, well, I want to tell you about my friends. And I tell you, well, I have this friend named Ross, and this friend named Chandler, this friend named Phoebe, and this friend named Rachel. And we do all these fun things together. And I start describing all our adventures that we have, all the crazy things that happen to us. And you're like listening, like, Tim, I think you're talking about the show called Friends. You might think, yeah, Tim, I don't think that those are your real friends. I think you're just using your imagination and just telling us about some TV show you watched. Now, if I said, yeah, you're right, that's what I'm telling you. Would I be describing the pure essential nature of friendship by talking about a TV show? No. That's not what friendship is. Those are just fake actors on the screen. If I think they're my friends, I'm deluded. In other words, I'm resting on an image of something that could be real. Now, look, let's talk about the next level up, an actual object. And maybe I tell you about my actual friends. No, not the ones I have to pay to be my friends. I'm just kidding. Absolutely, that's a bad joke. But like, for example, maybe I talk to you about my friend named Adiel. Now, Adiel, it's kind of an interesting name. It's actually in the Bible. But he's a close friend. I've known him since middle school. Or my friend Greg, who I went to college with. Or my buddy Aline. Um, or my friend Eddie, right? So Eddie and I have been friends for a couple decades, right? And I tell you about them and the things we do. Oh, we like to get together once in a while and do trap shooting or go surfing together, or we go fishing and hiking. And, and I tell you the things we talk about and about our families. You might be thinking, oh yeah, I believe you. Yeah, Tim believes that these are his friends. Why? Based on his experience with them. I can see them. I hang out with them. I talk to them. We spend time together, right? Now, could my belief that those objects, those individuals that I just described, Alan, Adiel, Eddie, right, that those are my good friends, could my belief be mistaken, right? Could they have all along just been hanging out with me because they know that, I'm a multi-billionaire and when I die, I'll leave them some money or something. They're secretly plotting my demise, right? So they can get an inheritance from me or something. Maybe. But in other words, I don't know. Maybe you've had friends that have turned on you. People you thought your friends, they weren't, right? Your belief was mistaken. Because these objects can come and go. My friends could be in my friends, right? Maybe we get in a big fight and we're no longer friends anymore. Maybe they move away. So we can't be friends, at least not as easily as we have been. Or maybe they die, right? I've not had any close friends pass away, but it's possible, right? Someday they will, and I'll miss them. But that's not what the essence of friendship is. The essence of friendship is up here. It's in this permanent, unchanging reality. And then we have to think about what friendship is. Now, we can do that with our understanding to get at the concept of friendship, but then we think about the essential nature of what is true friendship. And when we start describing those features of true friendship, then we really have an understanding of it through pure rational insight. Then we know what friendship is. And then we can measure these things down here by way of our perfect understanding of the essential reality up here. Just like, how do you tell what a good circle is? Well, you compare it to that pure being of a perfect circle, right? How do you tell if a square is a square? Right? You compare the ordinary objects, right? To, like, for example, I've got a hat here, right? Is this a good circle? Is it like this? Is that circular? No, is this a little better circular? I'm just talking about the rim here. Maybe I'll go this way. Right? This part, right? Is that more circular? Yeah, it's better. How about now? No, that's not as circular. How about now? No, that's even worse. How about now? That's even worse, right? This is more circular. Now, is it perfect? No. This is exciting. It's not. But that's the idea. There's a perfect circle, and we measure objects, ordinary circles, to that perfect thing. Just like I look at the essential nature of friendship, look at the people I hang out with and say, are these good friends? Right? And you can tell because you know that perfect being. Okay, let us continue on. Let's talk a little bit about Plato's aesthetics. Plato seemed to not like art so much because he thought it was a copy of a copy of a copy and encouraged ignorance, right? So, for example, going back to this painting, right? This is a copy of an imaginary conversation between Plato and Aristotle. Maybe they did get together and actually do this, right? Plato's pointing up, Aristotle's pointing down. Plato wasn't as excited about art as the essential perfect things that can exist, right? All right. Let's look at another illustration of this in what's called the allegory of the cave. So here's the idea. Plato thought that we're all like these prisoners stuck down here in this cave, and we can only see shadows on the wall. But these shadows are cast not by real horses or birds or circular objects or vases, um, pots or whatever these are, but by statues of things, right? And this fire casts these shadows. And these prisoners think that these are real. So if you ask this dude down here, hey, what's a horse? He'd say, well, a horse is a two-dimensional object that flickers and fades and, is two-dimensional and is monochromatic. It's one kind of color, dark, gray. That's it. But now imagine if this guy got released and went up outside and could see up here real horses, right? He would recognize that what he was seeing down here was just something in his imagination. And that now that he's free, he can use his intellect to see the permanent, unchanging realities that are outside of the cave of ignorance. So again, this is the idea that the prisoners would be happier if they could see those permanent, unchanging realities. All right, now let's look at Plato's ethics here. Plato thought that the highest form of reality was called the good. He thought that all reality and all of knowledge is based on the good. That is, the good is kind of like the sun. The sun is the cause of all, say, of our, planets or planetary formation comes after solar formation. So really, our sun is our Earth, our present Earth, is dependent for its existence on the sun, and all life is sustained because if the sun went out, we'd all die. Right? Just couldn't live for very long. So that all of reality and everything we know is based off the sun, and the good is like the sun in that sense. This is an idea, a Greek idea, that immorality and ignorance are connected. The idea here is that if I want to be good, I can't be ignorant. So, because I need to know what is good, then I have to know this ultimate formal reality, which is the good. Now, Plato thought that nobody willingly does wrong, but they always do what they believe is good. The unfortunate thing is we're often mistaken about what we believe is good. So Plato thought that when we have contact with the form of perfect goodness, this would transform us into a good person. Now, it doesn't happen overnight. And in Plato's Republic, in books from book 7 on, and even in the early parts of this book called The Republic, this is this book here. Use it a minute ago as an illustration. The Republic. You must read this if you want to be happy. You can be happy without it, but it's really a great book. Take my if you want to read this book with me, take my History of Western Philosophy class. In that class, we'll read that book. It's wonderful. So, all right, sorry, I got distracted. So, contact with the good will transform us into being a good person. Now, Plato assumed that this was an innate idea in humanity. Not that good was innate, but that our desire for it was, and that we could achieve it. Now, Plato thought this because he thought that the human soul had three parts to it. We had a rational part, a spiritual part, and an appetitive part. Reason is our intellect. The spirit is where our will is and our emotions. I don't know, manliness, I suppose. This is like virtues and determination. And our appetite is like our body. So he has this three-part descriptive psychology. And in the Republic, he thinks that the proper ordering is to have reason rule in conjunction with the spirit over our body's appetites. And Plato also gives an analogy of a chariot, right? We have our body and our soul kind of pulling against each other. Now, Plato also had a political philosophy that kind of went along with his ethics. And some philosophers really kind of get bothered by Plato because Plato thought that. Now, look, I have to qualify this. In this book, The Republic by Plato, this is where Plato gets at his ethics. And he does it primarily by giving a big analogy between the soul and the state. Let me go back a slide. So Plato thought that the human soul was like a little miniature state. By state, I mean like a country. A city-state is what the ancient Greeks kind of lived under. And reason was like the ruling class of our reason of our human soul was like the ruling class. It was supposed to know what's good for the whole state. And the spirit was like the military or the police. It was the will, the action part of the state. And so just like our wills are supposed to carry out the dictates of what we know to be right, so too the auxiliary class of the state was supposed to enforce the laws came up by the philosopher kings, the leaders of the state, and the appetites were like the masses of the state. The people, ordinary workers, people would just do their jobs. Now, Plato kind of said that, you know what, in order to moderate the state, in order to have the state be in its proper order, he said it was okay to tell people things that may not be true just to keep them in line. That's a little crass. And this idea of the noble I is you have to remember it in the context of this idea that the state is like our intellects, right? So in other words, maybe we tell ourselves with respect to our intellect things that are true, but they're not exactly how things maybe could be. Or for example, maybe we tell ourselves stories that maybe they're fictional stories, but nevertheless they have in them a noble moral lesson. And Plato thought that the just society should emulate our three part of the soul. The reason, again, is the wise and philosopher kings. The spirit is like the warriors, and the appetites are like the artisans, the workers. Plato thought that within the soul. Now, remember, this is a whole analogy here for the state and the soul. But Plato, in his Republic, thought that in order to have the soul properly ordered, or rather the state properly ordered, that you had to have exclusive people who were trained as philosopher kings in order to rule properly. So he thought that only the normal people in the state could, intermarry with each other, have families, but not so much the rulers and the soldiers. They were much more restricted. Okay. So, look, this has been a really whirlwind overview of Plato's view of the state, of Plato's ethics, the idea of the forms. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot to think about with Plato, but hopefully this overview gives you a little bit of interest in some of his philosophy. It's fascinating. You could literally spend your whole life studying Plato, and some of you might. Maybe you should. You can make a career out of it. I'm serious. There are people who will pay you good money to talk about Plato and to know him. And each generation needs to come to grips with what Plato has to say because, it's all in Plato. If any of you are fans of C.S. Lewis, in The Last Battle, the book, the last part of the Chronicles of Narnia, um, Plato has one of the main characters say, it's all in Plato. It's all in Plato. Bless me, what do they teach the children in the schools these days? I think Lord Digory says that or something like it. It's all in Plato. He has a tremendous influence and someone you don't want to dismiss easily.
Stay psyched, Grom. You.